There are at least 275 criminal cases open in connection to last week's assault on the Capitol. Investigators continue to uncover disturbing red flags from just days before the attack. According to the Washington Post, FBI officials received warnings from Virginia that extremists were preparing to wage war on the Capitol. Threats called on protesters to, quote, get violent. Throughout the riot, we saw an undercurrent of racism. Some of it was blatant in the form of Nazi symbolism and white supremacist language. It was a stark reminder that the fight against hatred in America has still so far to go. Let's go ahead and bring in Ibram X. Kendi. Ibram is a CBS News contributor and the director of Boston University's Center for Antiracist Research. He's also the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. Ibram, thanks for joining us. Many people were quick to point out the difference in the way that Black Lives Matter protesters were treated during the summer of 2020 compared to how pro-Trump protesters were treated. What is behind the difference in treatment at a deeper level than just racism? What message does all of this send to Black and brown Americans as we try to make progress in this country?
I think what's happening at a deeper level is, I think, one of the most dangerous racist ideas really over the course of American history has been the idea of dangerous Black people. And so even when Black people are not armed, even when they are demonstrating against violence and against racism, they're viewed as dangerous by many people. And so therefore that causes a pretty significant police force or military force or response. By contrast, when people look at white folks, they see safety. And so even when people are plotting to occupy the White House, people still underprepare. People don't still see violence around the corner. And I think those two racist ideas, because we shouldn't necessarily see Black people and see violence and see white people and see safety, we cause, I think, that undercurrent of racism that we saw at the Capitol.
We saw a lot of blatant white supremacist symbolism on display at the Capitol during the attack. Why do you think that those symbols were featured so prominently at a protest that was supposedly about preserving our democracy and election results?
I think because in many cases, when those elected officials were lying that the election was stolen from Donald Trump, they were typically stating that those who voted in Philadelphia, in Detroit, in Atlanta, in cities with sizable Black populations, that those votes were illegal, that they were cast fraudulently. And those who believe that somehow Black folks shouldn't be voting or are corrupting the electoral process were susceptible to those types of ideas, even without evidence. And so I think it then, therefore, it made sense that those who were imagining that the election was stolen because of those Black folks who voted in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Atlanta were also those who, of course, are attracted to white supremacist symbolism.
President-elect Joe Biden was quick to respond to the attack as it was happening. Let's play for our viewers what he had to say.
The scenes of chaos at the Capitol do not reflect a true America, do not represent who we are. What we're seeing are a small number of extremists dedicated to lawlessness. This is not dissent. It's disorder. It's chaos. It borders on sedition. And it must end now.
You just heard Mr. Biden say that this is not true America, that this is not who we are. We've heard from others, though, who say that, yes, this is America. This is where we are as a nation. What do you take from the president-elect's comments and how those attitudes impact how we tackle white supremacy in this nation?
Well, I mean, during the siege and even after it, of course, you had both Democrats and Republicans, saying this is not who we are. And to say that this is not who we are, to say that white supremacist terror or violence is not who we are, is to say that it's not part of our politics, it's not part of our history. And that's just not true. Of course, as an historian, we write about the long history of white domestic terror in this country. But what I think we should be saying, instead of this is not who we are, we should be saying this is part of us, but we have to rid the country of it. If you don't accept that it's part of you, why would you do a radical surgery on it, especially when we know that surgery is going to be painful?
So maybe instead of this is not who we are, this is not who we should be, I guess, is the better refrain. All right. Well, throughout his campaign, this is not the promise of America, and we need to try and live up to that promise. Throughout the campaign, Mr. Biden promised to address racism and police brutality in the United States. He also is benefited by having a strong woman of color by his side. But what do you think the Biden-Harris administration really needs to do to make a significant impact in the battle against racism and police brutality?
Well, I think the Biden-Harris administration, as it relates to the fight against COVID-19, have pledged that they're going to trust the scientists, that they're going to trust science, that they're going to trust data. And I think those of us who are scholars and scientists who study racism, who uncover racial disparities, who can provide evidence for the actual policies that are leading to those disparities, we're hoping too that as it relates to racism and rooting out racism in this country, as their administration has pledged to do, that they would listen to the scientists too, that they would listen to the scholars too, that they would put science before politics. And I think if they do, then they will be successful, just as they will be successful putting science first as it relates to COVID-19.
Ibram, do you want, though, to address the other part of my question about police brutality and what you want to see the Biden-Harris administration do in terms of trying to root out systemic racism that exists in law enforcement in this country?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that it will be successful if Biden brings law enforcement officials with civil rights activists together to sort of talk it through. I think both law enforcement has its own sort of set of special interests that they're going to advocate for and that they've been advocating for quite some time. I think that what do criminologists, what do scholars who study police violence, what has certain communities done to reduce levels of police violence, what has been shown to work, those are the types of things I think the Biden administration should be looking towards. And I certainly believe that it should not be based on what is politically viable, what's going to satisfy the law enforcement community, what's even going to satisfy any community. It should be based on what's actually going to work. And for too long, particularly as it relates to police violence, both Democrats and Republicans have leaned more on politics than what's actually going to be successful.
Ibram, I feel like I have so many more questions, and I'd love to talk to you for a long time, but I only have time for one more. So you have written several books tackling race, and you also just signed a deal with Netflix to turn your books into movies. Following the death of George Floyd, you called on people to do the anti-racist work in 2020. How would you assess how well we have done with anti-racism in this country?
Well, I think more and more Americans are aware of racism. The polls show that. But I think awareness is not enough. Awareness of a problem is certainly not enough. What we have to do, we have to transform our awareness into action. We have to have a willingness to support policies that can actually eliminate racial disparities and inequities, or even police violence, as we were talking about. And even if those policies may be uncomfortable, we have to be willing to support solutions that could lead to change. It's not enough to say that racism is a problem if we're not willing to support the solutions that can eliminate it.
Ibram X. Kendi, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.